You're listening to a podcast from Meaning of Life TV.
Hi, my name is John Horgan. I'm a science writer. I teach at Stevens Institute of Technology, and I've been yammering about science and related stuff on Meaning of Life TV and Blogging Heads TV, and now I have my own little niche called Mind Body Problems for a really long time now. And it's really fun because basically I just try to find people that it would be fun to talk to, whether or not we were being recorded. And, we just shoot the shit for a while. So with me today is one of my favorite scientists and people. I've only met you a couple of times, but I have great admiration for you. Sabine Hossenfelder, a German physicist who has really strong opinions about physics. And I just have to say that you're so good for physics. You're so good for science in general. I really believe that, even though you say some things that I find outrageous, that upset me. So we can get into some of that today. But I'm going to let you talk eventually. But let me say one more thing first. I have been, for more than a year now, immersed in quantum mechanics, trying to understand it. And it's your fault. You released a video in May last year. You said, you've got these fantastic videos. They've made you like an internet sensation. And this one, you said, okay, I'm going to explain the difference between entanglement and superposition. And I saw that teaser and I thought, damn, I've always wondered about that. Okay, I'm gonna watch this. I'm gonna understand the difference between entanglement and superposition. And so then I watched it, and it was like, I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes long. And I thought, wow, that's pretty brief to cover these very deep, difficult concepts. And I'm like with you. I'm with you for, I don't know, maybe 90 seconds or 2 minutes. And then suddenly, bam, I hit a wall, as I kind of expected I would. And I didn't really understand. You introduced a couple of technical terms and a little bit of math, as I recall. And I was lost. And I've had this feeling over and over again. I've been writing about physics for like 30 years now. And without understanding the mathematics and the sort of technical intricacies. And for some reason, this morning, it bothered me. It really bothered me. And I decided, also all my summer plans had been dashed because of the pandemic. And I decided, I'm going to learn quantum mechanics. So I don't have to take the word of all these smarty pants like my friend Sabina about what's really going on. So I've been doing it for, 15 months now. So I want to thank you for that. I'm actually working on a book on it now. Other members of the physics community might say, they might not want to thank you. They might say, it's your fault that we have another stupid John Horgan book inflicted on us now. But anyway, welcome. How are you doing? And what have you been up to lately?
Well, first of all, apologies that you found my video somewhat incomprehensible. In my defense, I have to say this is like part 5 of a series or something. So hopefully if you had actually started with the first part, it would have been a little bit more comprehensible. But yeah, so every once in a while I show an equation. And I do this because personally, I think if you don't actually show the math, you'll never really understand it. So I'll be curious to see what's in your book. If you came to the same conclusion, if you think in the end that you can do it with words, if you use sufficiently many words. I don't know.
Yeah, that in a way, that's kind of what the book is about. The degree to which you can or cannot translate from mathematics into ordinary language. And we're going to get into that. Because this topic actually comes up in a book that you are writing now. And, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So can you just like give us a little bit of the background on the book?
Yeah. So you're the first person to actually read the book, except for my editor, who kind of has to read it. And, my husband and my mother are stuck somewhere in the middle, but I hope they will get there eventually. Mm-hmm. And this is the first time I'll be talking about it. So I'm a little bit afraid there will be some stuttering and I'm not really exactly sure I want to say this. So bear with me. I'll do my best. And I have to start practicing this somehow. So the book is called More Than This. And yes, I know there's a song with the same name and so on and so forth. And I think my main message with the book was to say physics is more than just balls rolling down inclined planes or Van de Graaff generators and that kind of thing. For me, physics has always been about trying to answer the really big questions about the universe. And in this book, I take on what I think are those big questions. Other people might disagree what the big questions are. But those are like my big questions. And it's stuff like, does the past still exist? Can the universe think? Can there be galaxies inside every particle? Could there be copies of us out in the multiverse? Do we live in a computer simulation? Why doesn't anyone ever get younger? That kind of thing. And so every chapter is a question, and then I do my best to answer the question. But I think my main message is more that physics is a tool that allows you to address these questions and make headway on them.
Yeah. First of all, let me say, I'm a big fan of your writing. And so I loved your book because it sounds like you the whole way through. And that's a gift. A lot of writers just don't have that. A lot of writers don't have a distinctive voice. You have a very distinctive voice. And I think,
and it has a German accent.
Yeah, right. For some reason, I'm the German accent comes through as I'm reading. I'm picturing you, saying these things, and part of the charm is that you just seem like you say exactly what you think, and that is not. You can't take that for granted. I think a lot of popular books. Big time physicists, I think even Stephen Hawking did this in Brief History of Time, which kind of is the template for popular books by physicists. There's like a soft peddling of the physics to a certain extent to make it sound a little bit more, spiritual than it really is, a little bit more consoling and softer. And your book has some consolation, but you're very blunt also in dismissing certain things, like, free will, which is something really important to me. I'm not going to bring that up yet, but I just want to say this is a characteristic of your writing, this kind of absolute bluntness. And I trust you to say what you mean in a way that I don't trust a lot of other scientist authors. But I want to start by taking up one of the big themes of your book that has puzzled me for a while, and it puzzles me more now because I've been studying quantum mechanics for the last year. It's determinism. I still don't understand, even though you explained it. And also one of the books I've read is Leonard Susskind's book on quantum mechanics, which is, has a lot of mathematics and it's much more technical than yours. But he's also adamant that quantum mechanics is deterministic. Or the picture that physics gives us of the world is deterministic. And I don't understand how that can be the case when, as you also acknowledge, quantum mechanics injects this element of randomness into at least our observations of the world. So how does that work?
Well, maybe we should first clarify what we mean by determinism.
Okay.
I think that might be helpful. So if you take all the information you can possibly have about the present moment and try to make a prediction for what happens in the future in a deterministic universe, you can tell exactly what's going to happen. Theoretically, in practice, there are always issues like that. You can't measure everything precisely, and then there's chaos and all that kind of thing. But if you just look at the math, the initial state determines what comes later, which just means there is a map to that state in the future, and you can calculate it in principle. Now, the peculiar thing about quantum mechanics is that it actually has two equations that tell you what's going to happen. And the first equation is the Schrödinger equation. And the Schrödinger equation is what we call an evolution law. That just tells you, that just says that the evolution law tells you how the state changes in time. So you start with some initial state, and then you apply the evolution law to it, and that tells you what happens at any later time. And in a classical theory, that's the end of the story. You only have this evolution law, and then you calculate what's going to happen as good as you can. Now, in quantum mechanics, you have the second thing, which is the update of the wave function, or sometimes called the collapse of the wave function, or the reduction of the wave function. Is all the same thing. And that is not deterministic. And that basically tells you, you take this wave function and you use it to calculate the probabilities for certain measurement outcomes. For example, where am I going to see the electron on the screen? Or what's its spin? Or, what's the energy of, I don't know, some excitations in an atom or something like that. And from the wave function, you can calculate the probability for getting a particular measurement outcome. But then, of course, when you measure it, you don't get the probability, you just get the outcome.
Yeah.
And now the problem is that at this point, you need to update the wave function for it to say, now the particle or whatever it is that you measured is with 100% probability at this position. And that's not deterministic. There's a large variety of initial wave functions that can all give you the same measurement result. And so when people say quantum mechanics is deterministic, they only refer to this time evolution, the Schrödinger equation. And then there are the many worlds people who actually believe that this is the only thing you need. And I would disagree. I think these people are just really, really confused.
Well, to me, what you described, the situation you described, is still non-deterministic. The Schrödinger equation applies to the many worlds people would say it applies to the multiverse. The multiverse evolves deterministically, but in this universe we live in, there is the Schrödinger equation only gives us the probability that a certain thing will happen. That to me, by definition, is deterministic. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I still feel like I'm missing something.
So I'm not sure I follow. You think it is indeterministic or it is deterministic?
It is not deterministic because when you make the measurement, you only get something that was predicted probabilistically by the Schrödinger equation. So how is that deterministic? That's what I don't get. Oh, okay. All right. Well,
You're right. And I would disagree with everybody who says the opposite.
What I thought, okay, so then in the beginning of your book, the first chapter, you talk about time and you introduce what I would call, what actually Susskind calls the minus first law, which is basically information is conserved. And I thought that this is directly tied to a deterministic picture of the world. So maybe you can just tell me about why some physicists, including yourself, I think, believe that information is conserved.
So when I begin the book, I talk about the classical deterministic evolution. That's without quantum mechanics. And then at the end of this chapter, I say, well, there are two loopholes to this. And the one loophole is black holes. Black hole evaporation more precisely. And the other one is the measurement problem in quantum mechanics.
Right.
But I didn't want, in the first chapter to throw everything at people. I hate these books where you first have to read like 100 pages introduction.
Yeah.
Before you get to the thing. So I decided to first introduce the classical deterministic evolution and figure out what we can learn from this. And then I talk about this random element that quantum mechanics brings in later. And then I mentioned this in a short sentence or something. So now I've forgotten the question.
Oh, the conservation of information.
Oh, the conservation of information. Yeah. So the problem is that information is a vague word. So I actually don't know exactly what Susskind may have been referring to. But the way that people usually talk about the preservation of information and the foundations of physics, the only thing they mean is that the time evolution is reversible.
Okay.
So it's not just deterministic in the sense that you can predict what's going to happen in the future. But if I gave you the thing in the future, you can't predict where it came from. And so if that's the case, then you could say, well, if I can always calculate one thing from the other, then the information in both is the same. And I know that people always get confused about exactly what you mean by information, but you actually don't need to know it. The only thing that information means in this context is the specification of the initial state, whatever that is. It depends on what your theory is.
Okay, but you make a very dramatic claim at the end of that chapter that I would put in the category of a kind of consolation. And you say that, and it's related to this question that you're asked at the beginning of the book by somebody who's asking whether his dead grandma is still alive in some sense. And at the end of this discussion of conservation of information, you say, yeah, your grandma is preserved. She's immortal in a sense. Her information is out there in the fabric of the universe. And when I first encountered this idea, the conservation of information, I was so struck by it, and it was in Susskind, that I wrote a column about it, basically saying, like, bullshit, tell me another one, you physicists. You call yourself atheist, but, you're trying to make us feel better, and I don't buy it. Like, my father died a year ago. So my father somehow lives on in the fabric of the universe. So is that, and that seems to be, you're talking about a very kind of humanistic form of information there. So I guess I want to know, do you really believe that like everything is preserved somehow in the fabric of reality?
Yeah, I actually believe it. So as I discuss in the book, there are two things that stand in the way that we know of. The one is the evaporation of black holes, which looks like it can destroy information. Like if you throw something into a black hole and then it evaporates and only leaves behind this Hawking radiation, which is always the same if the black hole had the same mass. That looks like it's not time reversible. So this is something which I've worked on for a really long time. I think most people who work in the field don't actually think that actually happens. You always run into this problem that to really describe what goes on in the evaporation of a black hole is you need a theory of quantum gravity, and we don't have one. Right. So really no one knows. Right. I mean, that's like what I can say with confidence. Really, no one knows. But most people think that if we had this theory of quantum gravity, it would be time reversible, because all the other quantum theories that we know are also time reversible. And the other thing is the measurement process in quantum mechanics itself, which, as we already discussed, is not deterministic and is also not time reversible. So if you only have the final outcome, you don't know where it came from. And if that's actually really how nature works, then information is not preserved.
Yeah.
But I don't think that this is really a fundamental process. I think it's just a crutch that we've put into place that eventually it will be replaced by something else, something better, something more fundamental. But yeah, so those are the two things that you kind of have to buy if you think that information is preserved. But yeah, I mean, then that's just what the laws of nature tell you. And I agree what you say, that this is a very spiritual point of view. And I sometimes think that physicists are not really aware of how big a consequence it really is.
I totally agree with that statement. And I'm leaning more in that direction now than I was before, my whole quantum project started. I want to, one other point I want to make about this conservation of information, which I find so fascinating. By the way, Susskind sometimes equated it with the principle of unitarity.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Unitarity is actually, it's a little bit more. So a unitary transformation is time reversible. So, and that's the relevant property, but it also is more than this, because it also conserves probabilities. So you want to make sure that probabilities always add up to 100%. Otherwise, quantum mechanics doesn't really properly work. So the unitarity lumps these two things together. It's time reversible and it conserves probabilities. But for the information, the relevant part is that it's time reversible.
So I've done a lot of thinking about conservation laws, and I've also been reading Feynman in addition to Susskind and you, and so you're in really you're in good company. And it seems to me that that some physicists think that the conservation laws are like the deepest truths, and that's why I'm so fascinated again by conservation of information, because to me, information, the concept of information, and I've written about information theory, which is invented by Claude Shannon back in the 1930s. Information is used by John Wheeler in his it from bit formulation of quantum mechanics. The concept of information presupposes consciousness, or at least sentient observers who are packaging the information and sending it out, and then receiving the information. And so conservation, a corollary of conservation of information, it seems to me, is conservation of consciousness. And so it means, and again, if you're looking for consolation from physics, it seems to me that it's implying that consciousness, we don't have to worry about being extinguished. Let's say not as individuals, but an asteroid strikes the Earth and incinerates us. Well, that's too bad for us. But consciousness is conserved in the universe as a whole. It's always been there. It always will be there.
That sounds very romantic, but I think you've thrown together several definitions of information. So the information that people talk about when they say information is preserved because the time evolution is unitary has nothing to do with the stricter definition of information that people use in some other areas. And if you use these notions of information, and there are many different ones of them. For example, you can use certain notions of entropy. And I recently reviewed a book from Chiara Marletto about constructor theory, the physics of Can and Can't, or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And then she has another definition of information. And if you take those notions of information, they wouldn't be conserved. Which is why I'm sometimes a little bit unhappy with this way to phrase things. And so if you're talking about consciousness, it always comes down to what exactly do you mean by consciousness? And so for me personally, I would say consciousness has something to do with what happens. It's not just about can you reconstruct something, but it's actually about what you can do. And so from this physics perspective, at the fundamental level, if you think about the unitary evolution, if someone dies, what happens is that all this information that's in the configuration, it just spreads out all over, the planet, maybe over the universe in like teeny tiny correlations. So you can't really do anything with it. You can't talk to them anymore. We've all noticed this. So I would be a little bit uncomfortable to say that the consciousness is still there. I would be comfortable to say, in principle, theoretically, an omniscient being could reconstruct it because it wasn't actually lost.
Right. I'm just warning you. I'm gonna have a whole section on conservation of consciousness as a consequence of unitarity. And yeah, I'm like trying to follow your ideas to their completely crazy conclusions. All right.
You might want to have a look at Marletto's book, how she defines information. I've actually forgotten, so I don't. If I try to remember it now, it will be terrible. But I'll have a look at the book.
Okay, I think I read your review of it because it looked like it was about some of the ideas that are important to me. All right, so I want to go on to maybe the main difference between our worldviews, which is free will. And it seems to me free will, your view of free will is directly tied to your inclination to think that the universe is deterministic. So, I mean, can you just give us a brief description of your view of free will?
Well, the issue with free will is that it all depends on what you mean by the word.
Right.
And so what I did in my book was that I stated the problem without even referring to the word free will. And the problem is just that for all we currently know, and this is like, pretty much everything I say starts with this phrase, right? The fundamental laws of nature are deterministic, except for this random element in quantum mechanics, which we have no influence on. And now, whether you think that rules out free will or not depends on what you mean by free will. I would just say free will is just an incoherent idea. I can't make sense of it. Let's just forget about it and not use the word and find a better, more constructive way to think about what's happening.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll tell you what I mean by it. I mean, it's an experience that all of us have. So, I was, I don't know, whatever it was, like a week ago or so, I was thinking about some of the issues related to quantum mechanics, and I thought, hey, it'd be fun to talk to Sabina about some of this stuff. I wonder if she'd be up for that. And so then I and at that point, I had different options in my life. All of us at any moment have different things that we can do in the near future or the longer term future. And then I sent my bits through the internet to you, my little piece of information, and then you read it, and then you had to make a choice yourself. So to me, it's this experience that all of us have, that we are constantly making decisions that alter the trajectory of our bodies as well as our minds in the future, right? That's what I mean by free will. And this is a really crucial point, and I think this distinguishes you from me. I think that our choices are not reducible to physics. They are not reducible to particles that are being pushed and pulled by various forces. There is a higher order of something happening that emerges from the particles. It's the psychological realm that that creates this thing called choices or free will. I agree, free will is not the best term, because I also accept that I'm a completely physical creature. I've got genes. I'm limited in all sorts of ways. I'm getting old. I'm going to die someday. I can't fly. I'm not free, and I'm limited by my genes and the kinds of things I can think about. I can't understand gauge theory. It's too hard. But within these constraints, I have all kinds of choices that are determined by my values, by what I want to do with my life. That's what I'm trying to defend.
Well, I would say you think you have choices because you don't know what you will do. I mean, if you use a phrase like, I had different options of what I could do, when you were thinking about, do you really want to talk to me or would you rather talk to someone else? You thought you have different options, but you didn't. It's just incompatible with the laws of physics. And, just by saying, well, I believe there's some higher realm, and it doesn't make the laws of physics go away. Now, there are some people who, like Rovelli and Sean Carroll and so on, who have tried to, and what's the person with the book, How Physics Makes You Free? I keep forgetting her name. It's a strange name. It'll come back to me at some point.
Facillin or something like that. Anyway, okay, go.
No, it's something Ismail or something. So it's So whatever. And so what they are trying to do is they are trying to find a definition of free will on an emergent level.
Right.
And you can do this if you want. I mean, it's not wrong, but it doesn't change anything about the fact that the future was already determined up to some quantum random events that you couldn't influence because nothing can influence them. That's just, I'm sorry, for being the messenger of the bad news, but that's just how the laws of nature work.
Well, you don't have to feel bad because I totally reject that message. To me, it's, I guess, I see physics as being extremely powerful and useful in certain domains. But when it comes to the social and psychological domain, which is the one that we all live in mainly, physics tells us very little. So, for example, physics doesn't do a good job of explaining what we might call progress in human history, moral values, any kind of value. It doesn't explain beauty. There are all sorts of things that have no reference in the realm of physics. And so I guess I think it's wrong-headed of physicists to claim that they have some kind of authority in these realms that are based on their interpretations of, whether the Schrodinger equation is or is not deterministic, whether physics as a whole is deterministic. I actually just don't understand it because, and I often have this feeling when I get in conversations about free will, it's as though we inhabit different worlds, but I think mainly you inhabit the world of a physicist. And I'm mainly in the world of psychology and values and politics. And I don't know.
Well, everything is physics. You're made of particles. The only way you can claim that there's something else to psychology is to deny that you're actually made of physical things. Mm-hmm. And that's this whole dualism thing, which I would just say is unscientific. If you want to believe it, you can believe it. I don't know what it's really good for. But your brain is made of particles, and we know the laws for those particles. So what you're implicitly claiming, and that's always what it comes down to, is that somehow magically, if you put together a lot of those particles, boo, a miracle happens, and everything is different. And that's why I have free will, even though free will is incompatible with the fundamental laws of nature. And that's just magical thinking. I have a hard time taking this seriously. I always have this impression that, people who make an argument like this, they start from what they want to be true. Like, I want it to be true that free will exists. Therefore, I have to reject everything we know about physics. Too bad for physicists.
Well, I do want free will to be true. Life to me is meaningless without it. But also, I believe in free will because I experience it. There's evidence for it coming at me overwhelmingly every single day. Now, I want to refer to something.
So what's the evidence that if you make one decision, what's the evidence that you have that you could have done something else? There's no such evidence.
I
only ever do one thing.
I totally believe in causation. I don't think that there's nothing I do that I could say is uncaused. I'm just saying that some of the causes are not, even though they're underpinned by physics, they're not physical causes. One of the things that I do sometimes in arguments like this is I cite something that you cited and dismissed, which is More is Different, this famous essay by Phil Anderson that came out in the 70s. And you dismiss it, but I don't understand why you dismiss it. It seems to me that Anderson is saying something that, again, is kind of self-evident, that physics can explain a lot of things, but then there's some higher order phenomena, like life and psychology, these sorts of things, social behaviors that are not predictable.
Well, they are predictable. That's the whole point. If you argue that they are not predictable, you're breaking something about what we already know to be true. And I would ask you, can you at least write down a hypothesis for how this can possibly happen? There isn't one. No one has any coherent theory for it. The only thing you can make it happen is to say, well, I just don't want to believe it. Okay, and that's where I start getting a problem. I mean, and I mean this seriously. Try to write it down. Try to write down any consistent theory in which you can have a layer of psychology, sociology, and so on, which does not derive from the physics of the underlying constituents. And I don't think it's possible, but at the very least, I can tell you that no one's managed to actually do it.
I'm looking for a phrase that you had. What's it? The principle of finite imagination.
Yeah.
Okay, I love that phrase, and I think that that's kind of what we're talking about here. So my basic argument is that physicists don't know nearly enough. Scientists in general don't know nearly enough to rule out free will at this point. And if they just say, our equations are deterministic, therefore free will is impossible, everything is determined by particles, being pushed and pulled by various forces, they are just going beyond what their science can actually tell us about the world, and they're suffering from a deficit of imagination. What I would do is point to the complete incoherence of theories of consciousness, like how you get consciousness out of matter. And you talk about some of these, which are pretty crazy in your book, like integrated information theory and panpsychism. As a science journalist, I sort of stand back from all of them and say they're all like just shots in the dark. Nobody really knows what they're talking about when they're talking about consciousness. Consciousness, of course, completely related to free will. And so if we have no coherent conception of how consciousness arises from matter, and I agree that it does somehow, but we don't know how at all, then it's like at the very least grossly premature to rule out free will. That's basically where I'm coming.
As I said, if you want to treat free will as an emergent concept, you can do this. That's the same that Rovelli does and what John Carroll does, and that's not inconsistent. I just don't really know what it's good for. It doesn't really change anything. The future is still determined up to random events that you cannot control. And that's something that physics can say something about, regardless of all the talk about psychology and sociology and so on and so forth. That's what physics can actually say something about. And, you have to try to invent a way to make it all go away. Now, about this principle of finite imagination, you can very well say, well, maybe that's just something that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. And that's all fine with me, because I always say, I can only tell you the status for all we currently know. And that's just what I'm saying. For all we currently know, the future is determined up to random events that we can't influence. So maybe 200-300 years from now, that will change because we figure out something which we don't yet know. But at this current moment, it doesn't look good for the idea that you can choose one of possible options.
Okay. I realize I'm not gonna change your mind, but I just felt like I had to give you a little pushback there. I want to go to another really interesting discussion that you had in your book on creation stories. And this is obviously related to religion and spirituality. So first of all, what about like kind of old-fashioned religious creation stories? Do you think science has ruled them out? I mean, that the world is only 6,000 years old and God created it according to certain fundamentalist interpretations of the Bible. Has science ruled on those, or do we have to be agnostic about them?
It really depends on exactly what you mean. I mean, there are certain things that science has ruled out. It depends, for example, what do you mean by creation, right? And so in this book, I try to make this point that, well, actually, that there are 2 points. One is that what we do in science is we come up with simple explanations, and the problem with this creation story, like there was some omniscient being called God who created all the dinosaurs in place, dinosaurs bones in place, or whatever this story looks like. It's just hideously complicated, right? If you say everything came out of some plasma with small fluctuations, and those collapsed under the pull of gravity, and they formed galaxies and blah, 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 and evolution and so on and so forth. That is a much simpler story, and that makes it scientifically a better explanation. Mm-hmm. And then you can say, well, but I still want to believe that God made something, and I would say, well, if that doesn't conflict with evidence, you're free to believe it. That's fine with me. And then I have this interview with Tim Palmer, and I knew this, of course, before we did the interview, but I wanted him to explain this himself, who points out that you can understand the creation of the universe as breathing fire into the equations. So it's basically it's an as scientific event that happens, so that's his word, which I like so much that I carry it through the book, as opposed to unscientific.
Right.
It's just something that science doesn't say anything about, because we have in our theories no difference between an equation that has fire in it and one that doesn't. We just use these equations to describe what we see. And so what I like about this is that it highlights that these creation myths, not only this, but also other ones, if you don't take them too literally, they're not so different from some of the things that we talk about in physics today.
Yeah. Okay. So can you just give us a little on that? Because I think some people might have the impression that physics has basically solved the problem of how the universe was created. And you've got theories like inflation, you've got the multiverse theories. So can you just give us your quick rundown on?
Well, this is all unconfirmed. I mean, yeah. So inflation is, I think, one of the how do I put it? Most miscommunicated ideas. Like it's the confidence that physicists put into it vastly overstates how much we actually know.
Right.
And when it comes to inflation, I mean, basically the problem is we do have some observations from the early universe, like the cosmic microwave background and that kind of thing. We're hoping to see gravitational waves from the early universe at some point. These are the so-called primordial gravitational waves, but they're hard to detect, and we haven't actually yet done it. If we one day manage to detect them, that would actually allow us to look back before the creation of the CMB. But either way you put it, there is some time in the early universe before which we don't have any observations. And so what do? Well, you can just take the theories that we have and just assume they remain valid, and then you can run them back in time. And if you do this, you get the Big Bang scenario. So you find that, there's just a singularity, which means that the equations break down, and that's the end of the story. So it's rather uninspiring to some extent. And now physicists have tried to replace this naive extrapolation into the Big Bang with other theories. And there are dozens of them. And inflation is the currently most popular one, but it's certainly not the only one. There's, for example, maybe the next famous one is Penrose's cyclic cosmology. But there are also other ones where you have, you start with basically a phase where there's no time at all. This is the idea with the no boundary proposal. And there are other ideas like that. It's a little bit similar to the cyclic idea, but there's only one bounce. So there was a previous universe, and then it bounces, and then now there's our universe. So no bang, but a bounce, and so on. And you can go through the list. There are just lots of them. And the point is, if you look at the evidence that we have right now, you can't tell them apart.
Right.
So that's the current status, and I think everyone who makes a different claim either didn't understand the data or they're just making things up.
What's your feeling about whether the origin of the universe is a solvable problem? So we have the Big Bang theory, but what led to the Big Bang? What, if anything, preceded the Big Bang? The hope was that a unified theory of physics, if you go back to some of the rhetoric of the 80s and 90s coming from Stephen Hawking and Steven Weinberg and people like that, the hope was that a unified theory might also tell us how the universe came to be and why it's this universe rather than some other universe. What's your feeling about whether that's a viable goal still?
Well, the problem is that I think with the type of theory which we currently use, exactly what we've been talking about, you have an initial state, you have an evolution law, and then maybe every once in a while you have an update of the wave function. You just can't solve the problem because you always need an initial state. And then you can always ask, well, where did this initial state come from?
Yeah.
Right. Well, it came from an even earlier initial state. And where did this come from? So it's this chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
And there might be other theories which don't need an initial condition, but definitely the type of theory that we currently use won't do. And I actually think that David Deutsch's constructor theory, how it calls it, might be a theory that can possibly achieve this. It's somewhat unclear because the whole idea is somewhat unclear, but in principle, he has this idea that you talk about the properties, the principles underlying the laws. And there are some other things that you can think of. For example, it gets a little bit mathematical here, but the underlying problem is that all the theories that we currently use are based on differential equations. Mm-hmm. So certain type of equation that tells you how in small increments things change from one moment to the next or from one place to the next. And that's not the only type of equation in existence. There are lots of other ways that you can write down mathematics, and not all ways to formulate a structure for the universe need to be differential equations. It's just that, so it's an interesting question. Why did we end up using differential equations? And I think it's because it corresponds to the way that we think about science. We prepare something and then we look, what does it do? And that's basically what a differential equation tells you. So it's kind of a very natural thing to do, but that doesn't mean that's fundamentally how it really works, that it will always remain some formulation of differential equations. It could just be something else. So to hopefully answer your question, I think it might be solvable, but not with the kind of theory that we currently use.
All right. So you reminded me of, there was another sort of big issue I wanted to bring up. And I feel like, this is kind of what I do. I look for contradictions, what I think are contradictions in other people's thinking. But here's another one that I thought I spotted. You're really committed. I think your deterministic outlook and your suspicion of free will comes from a commitment to certain kinds of mathematics that are deterministic, like differential equations. One of your great videos, you talked about, everything is describable by differential equations, which show things evolving instant by instant and so forth. But then you also have this discussion of the idea whether reality is really math, right? And so, Max Tegmark had what I think is a ridiculous book, The Mathematical Universe, I think it was called. And, it's kind of Platonism updated. And you just demolished that. And this is related to the principle of finite imagination. I think you're saying maybe there's entirely new math out there that we haven't thought of, or maybe there are non-mathematical ways of describing reality. So who are we to say, you're basically saying it's premature to say that reality is mathematical, whatever that even means. And I thought that was reflecting a kind of skepticism, agnosticism, whatever you want to call it, kind of an open-mindedness about possibilities being out there we haven't even imagined yet, that undercuts your commitment to determinism. Does that seem fair?
Well, I think you might overstate how strongly opinionated or committed I am to one thing or another. So, in this book, I really have two jobs. The one job is to say, this is what we know. and this is what we can conclude from what we've learned, and this is what the evidence says, and this is how we came to this conclusion, and so on. And then I also say, yeah, but look, there are some things we don't know, right? And so some things could change here. And this issue with the question, like, is mathematics really the last word, so to say, on the question, how does nature work? This is something which I've thought about for a ridiculously long time. And I ended up writing an essay about it, which is called Beyond Math, which you find on the FQXI website somewhere. And I came to the conclusion, no, you actually can do science, even if nature is not mathematical. And then, to credit Tegmark, his mathematical universe hypothesis got me thinking about it. So, I'm of two minds about it. On the one side, I have to say mathematics is great. I love mathematics. I originally studied mathematics. And there's much more to discover, and there's fancier math. So just because there's something which we don't currently understand very well, like, for example, consciousness, doesn't mean there's no math that can describe it. Maybe we just haven't found it. Mathematics is a big realm. On the other hand, we've only just begun trying to figure out how nature works. So God knows, maybe there's something better than mathematics, something that's maybe more suitable to describe consciousness or figure out how the universe began, or that kind of thing. I mean, it's certainly something that you can't just rule out. From what? Based on what do you want to rule it out, right?
Yeah, David Bohm said, I interviewed him shortly before he died, and he said, he was sort of a peculiar visionary figure as well as a really good physicist. And he said he thought that science might evolve away from mathematics and toward some other way of understanding reality. So speaking of David Bohm, since I'm so obsessed with quantum mechanics right now, what do you think about there's, a lot of people are obsessed with quantum mechanics now, trying to figure out what it means. And you discuss it in your book, in your usual, very clear, blunt way. So can you give us a quick overview of your view of interpretations of quantum mechanics?
Oh, Jesus. We'll still be talking in 3 hours or something like that. So to me, the interpretations of quantum mechanics are just different ways to look at the same math. Right. So from this mathematical point of view, it doesn't really make any difference. But that doesn't mean that interpretations are entirely unnecessary, because different ways to look at the math can actually help you to understand something different. And there's to name the obvious things, there's the Copenhagen interpretation. That's all this business with the spontaneous collapse of the wave function. And then there's many worlds, or the Everett interpretation. There is Bohmian mechanics, which people argue about whether it's an interpretation. I would say it's an interpretation, but sometimes people try to give me a hard time about it, and that would be a really long discussion. But I will insist it's an interpretation. And then there are things like spontaneous collapse models, right, like GRW and that kind of thing. And I would say those are not interpretations. They're actually different theories, because right, there's something different happening. And also Penrose's idea that gravity induces the collapse of the wave function. So these are actually modifications of quantum mechanics. So they would be more fundamental theories. There are lots of other interpretations. I kind of feel like I've left out a few.
Well, those are the big ones. Let me, because we don't have much time left.
Coherent histories, that kind of stuff, is kind of a many worldish idea.
And then there's one called Many Minds. Oh, and then there's cubism.
Cubism, that's I've always struggled. Cubism is kind of a sexed up version of the Copenhagen interpretation. So.
Yeah, and it's related to John Wheeler's "it from bit" concept. I guess here's my the sort of deeper question I wanted to get at is, will we make sense of quantum mechanics someday, or will it yield to a deeper theory that gets rid of some of what we think of as paradoxes or the strangeness of the theory, its violation of common sense? I guess my deeper question is it too much to expect that reality will make sense to us someday?
Well, I definitely think that quantum mechanics will be replaced by an underlying deeper theory, and I think it will make more sense. I think the major reason why people find quantum mechanics so hard to understand is that it's just internally inconsistent. And there are more and more people coming to the same conclusion. You know, there's actually been a lot going on in quantum foundations in the past years with all kinds of people putting out new theorems, debating exactly what you have to give up to make sense of all this mess. And I hope that in the end they'll just come to the conclusion, well, it's inconsistent. We need a better theory. So I think it can't be the last word. And it's not a big secret that I think the right way to move forward is what's called superdeterminism. And I could talk about this for 2 hours, but we don't have that amount of time. Basically, what it does for you is that it replaces this weird update of the wave function that, voila, now something happens and we don't know what it is, with a gradual process that actually results in a state, which is what we actually observe, which is what you want a theory to do, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got to admit, my feeling, I wrote this book 25 years ago called The End of Science. And the premise was that science has done such a good job of describing the world that, we're going to get sort of additions to knowledge, but nothing really dramatic like quantum mechanics. And, quantum mechanics is part of the foundation of physics. Now, I'm more confused by quantum mechanics than ever, but it seems like a house of cards. It seems very fragile. It seems like this kind of weird contraption that could be toppled at any moment. Although, it's been around for 100 years. But I feel like there could be a revolution. So I've actually changed my mind about the end of science. I feel like there could be a revolution coming, or maybe there should be a revolution, is what I'm saying.
I definitely hope there will be a revolution coming. And also, if that's correct, it will not remain interesting only for the foundations of quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics is so important for modern technologies. That would just propagate up the whole ladder into all kinds of applications. Not immediately, but eventually it will.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we're out of time. I don't want to keep you any longer. But so I'll just say thank you. Love your book. I look forward to it actually being published. When might that happen? Like next year sometime?
Yeah, probably in the early summer, something like this. I don't yet have a publication date, but I hope I'll have a date soon.
Okay. Well, congratulations. It's gonna get people arguing and talking about it, which is what you want.